To those that are here, hello everyone, thank you for coming, and happy Valentine's Day. It's a perfect day to express our love for biological anthropology with this seminar. As you may have noticed from our promotional material, today's talk was organised as a collaboration between the Archaeological Field Club, Cambridge University Biological Anthropology Society, and the Cambridge Journal of Human Behaviour. The opportunity presented itself for us to collaborate, so we thought this would be a good way to reach a broader audience and support fellow Cambridge societies with overlapping interests. Today we'll be hearing from Professor Daniel Lieberman, who will be asking the question, why is exercise weird but healthy? The active grandparent hypothesis. And although I am sure you are familiar with Dan, his research, we just wanted to briefly introduce our speaker as usual.
Thanks, Georgina. So Professor Lieberman is the chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. He's the Edwin M. Lerner Professor of Biological Sciences and a Professor of Human Evolutionary Biology. He has gone from a Cambridge student himself, having received his MPhil in Biological Anthropology here in 1987, to required reading for all archaeology undergraduates specializing in biological anthropology. He is renowned in his research regarding the evolution of hominin locomotion, and most especially his research on endurance running. He's also greatly interested in evolutionary medicine, the evolution of the human head, the study of physical activity, its energetics, biomechanics, and how all of these were brought about by evolution.
Yeah, and as Sophia mentioned, while all of us studying biological anthropology here have to read a bit of his academic work, I first became familiar with Professor Lieberman and his work what for me was many years ago, with his multiple appearances on the American public television show Nova, in which he can be seen talking about evolution in one scene, conducting scientific studies on running in another, and then physically running around Cambridge, Massachusetts himself in yet another scene. And beyond his appearances on public television, he has communicated science to the public via some of his books, such as The Story of the Human Body, Evolution, Health, and Disease, as well as Exercise, Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. He is also on the Scientific Executive Committee of the Leakey Foundation and has been elected to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And finally, he's also awarded the 2009 Ig Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on why pregnant women don't tip over. So with that, let's please welcome Professor Dan Lieberman.
Thank you. I think my Ig Nobel is by far my thing I'm most proud of. So let me share my screen here. And it's very kind of you to invite me virtually to this meeting. And I had a great time back in the day at Cambridge, and very fond of my memories there. So, and happy Valentine's Day to everybody. So today I'm going to talk about why exercise is weird but healthy, and the active grandparent hypothesis. And I hope that we can engender a little bit of a discussion. So without further ado, as the very kind introduction just mentioned, I study how and why the human body is the way it is. I started off as a paleontologist interested in fossils, but my work I still do some of that, but my work has really evolved into really studying the human body and living people. And so I combine field work with experimental biomechanics and physiology, which we do in the lab in the field, but I still also look at fossils and the fossil record and comparative anatomy. So it's kind of a mixture of things. And over the years, my research has kind of shifted to studying the evolution of human physical activity. And I'm probably best known for my work on running, but I've studied all kinds of other physical activities like walking and throwing and things like that. And if you work on this kind of stuff, you quickly, or excuse me, I should say that a lot of the talks I typically give are sort of, biomechanics. And a lot of the work we do in my lab is, for example, on biomechanics of locomotion. And so I'd be happy giving lectures on, foot biomechanics and that kind of stuff and whatever. But today, I'm going to give a kind of a 30,000 foot talk, kind of a grand picture, kind of a big picture, to give an evolutionary discussion about physical activity and exercise and why it's so healthy. And so I want to ask two kind of 30,000 foot questions. The first is, why, if exercise, do most people avoid it? So in the United States, for example, and I don't think England is any different, if you take the World Health Organization recommendation that everybody get 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a week, Only about 20% of Americans do that. The other 80% don't. In fact, only 50% of Americans ever exercise at all. And then the second question I want to ask is, why is exercise increasingly healthy as we age? And I think an evolutionary perspective can help us with both of these questions. So to do that, I'm going to propose two hypotheses. So one is the active couch potato hypothesis, which is that we evolved to be physically active, but to avoid unnecessary physical activity, aka exercise. And then, perhaps more importantly, the active grandparent hypothesis, which we just published in PNAS, which is that we evolved extended health spans, so the years that you live without major disease. And of course, in the old days, before modern medicine, health span equaled lifespan. Not just to be physically active, but also because of physical activity. Okay. And of course, our basic framework is natural selection, which of course is the combination of variation, heritability, and differential reproductive success, which favors adaptations, right? Novel features that were shaped by natural selection that improve reproductive success. And of course, a very basic idea behind natural selection is that energy is really very often selected, right? The basic equation of life is using energy to make more life, right? And for most creatures, modern humans, especially from the royal family accepted, energy availability is a limited resource, right? When you have limited resource, like the time you're spending listening to me right now is time that you can never spend doing something else, right? So when you have a limited resource, you have to engage in trade-offs. You have to make decisions about how you're going to allocate that limited resource. And a standard way of thinking about this is often called energy allocation theory. So you can spend the energy that you get from eating food on 5 things, right? You can spend it on growing, you can spend it on maintaining your body, you can use it to store fat, so that's a two-way arrow. You can spend it on reproduction, and you can spend it on physical activity. And ultimately, the only thing that natural selection really cares about in the end is how many offspring you have who survive and reproduce. So if you can save on growth and maintenance and storage and physical activity, you can then devote more of it to reproduction, and natural selection is pretty much always going to favor that. Okay, so that leads to this first hypothesis, the active couch potato hypothesis, that we evolved to be physically active to avoid unnecessary physical activity. In other words, there was strong selection to allocate energy from physical activity towards reproduction. And in my opinion, we could go back really far, but I'm going to just talk about this as a two-stage process. The first involving the origins of the hominins from the great apes, and the second, the origins of the genus Homo. So great apes are essentially have been selected to be couch potatoes, right? So chimpanzees, gorillas, other great apes have very costly life histories compared to most monkeys, right? They spend a lot more time growing, so they have a longer period of infancy and juvenility. They also have extremely costly locomotion. If you put an oxygen mask on a chimpanzee and get it on a treadmill, it spends about twice as much energy per unit mass per unit distance as a typical mammal, including humans. And as a result, these animals are incredibly inactive. If any of you have had the good fortune to spend time watching chimpanzees or gorillas in the wild, you'll know that, well, you better bring a book, because they're most of the time they're really not doing much of anything. They're just kind of lounging around eating. In fact, they spend 50% of their day just stuffing their mouths. So this is a paper that Dave Reichland and I just published just a few weeks ago, actually, in Current Biology, where we collected all the data on steps per day and distance traveled for various apes. As you can see, if you look at the great apes, they have very small numbers of steps per day. Even sedentary humans, average humans in industrialized countries, have higher step counts per day than the great apes. And of course, hunter-gatherers are way, way, way higher, about 18,000 steps a day. And there are many ways of measuring this, and a very simple one, which is actually flawed, but nonetheless useful, is what's called the physical activity level, which is your PAL, which is your total energy you spend in a day divided by your basal metabolic rate. So theoretically, this corrects for body size. Actually, it's a somewhat flawed metric, but it's reasonable. It's good enough for what we're talking about today. And most mammals have physical activity levels around 2 to 3. Whereas the great apes all have physical activity levels of 1.5 or less. They're by animal standards, they're couch potatoes. But humans, if you look at hunter-gatherers, for example, or humans from other parts of the world, we tend to have much higher physical activity levels. They average around 2. Of course, there's variation. So it's been about a 50% increase in that physical activity level metric. And so when and where did that happen? And as I said before, I believe that it really, it begins sort of a two-stage process. So the first stage was the origins of bipedalism. And we have pretty good evidence that the earliest hominins were bipeds of some sort. So Sahelanthropus, for example, whatever you think about all the controversies about it, there's no way this creature had a foramen magnum that pointed downward. And if a foramen magnum points downward, it's a biped. There's no other way for it to have locomoted. Ardipithecus has plenty of evidence that it was a biped of some sort or another. So we know that that's probably the major thing that set humans off on a different evolutionary path from the apes. And one of the potential advantages was that it's more efficient, right? So humans spend twice as less energy moving a given distance and a given mass than apes, but it also has trade-offs, right? Everything has trade-offs that have some setbacks. And one of them is that it makes us awkward. And the other is it makes us slow. If you have only 2 legs, you're just half as fast as if you had 4 legs. It's as simple as that. And so we must have been easy pickings for carnivores for millions and millions of years who could easily outrun even the very fastest human beings. So, of course, things get a little bit more sophisticated in the genus Australopithecus, and we know that they're effective walkers, but they also were still able to climb trees. But then the next big shift occurs in the genus Homo, right? And this is a period of major climatic change. So this is a graph that many of you hopefully have seen in class. This is the famous Zachos curve of the temperatures of the Earth's ocean over the last few million years. And you can see that starting around 2.8 million years ago, there's major cooling, right? And that's the beginning, essentially, of the Ice Age. And as that cooling occurs, we know from lots of evidence that there's environmental change. Now, it's not a completely simple story, but we know that there's essentially an increase in more open habitats. And if you're a hominin out there, used to living in somewhat wooded habitats, and you're in a more open habitat, that leads to an interesting challenge. And we know from the fossil record, as well as the archaeological record, that led to the hunting and gathering system, right? So this is a system where you have some combination of meat eating, whether from scavenging or hunting. You have extractive gathering, so you're not just picking berries off trees, you're also digging and collecting high quality resources. It involves tool making and food processing, and of course it involves cooperation. So this kind of combination of systems, of factors, leads to this wonderful system. But hunting and gathering is not work for couch potatoes, right? So we know, for example, that average human hunter-gatherers, if you adjust for body mass and also environmental temperature, are spending about 573 kilocalories per day more than say chimpanzees or and even more than gorillas on physical activity, on what we call active energy expenditure. A simple way of thinking about that is that your average chimpanzee walks 2 to 4 kilometers a day, whereas the average female hunter-gatherer walks 8 to 9 kilometers a day, and the average male hunter-gatherer walks 12 to 15 kilometers a day. And this is from widespread data from quite a few different groups. So clearly, physical activity levels are increased. And it's not just walking; it's also running. And one thing I've been very interested in my life is how did these wimpy bipeds manage to become meat eaters? Right, as I mentioned before, humans by virtue of being bipedal are necessarily slow. So Usain Bolt, for example, can run 10.4 meters a second at his fastest, or when he was still competing, but he couldn't only do that for a few seconds, right? For less than 30 seconds. And of course, he has no natural weapons or natural defenses. Your average mammal out there in the savannah can run twice as fast as Bolt, and for many, many more, many times longer, right? For at least 4 minutes. And the kinds of weaponry that we typically associate with hunting were not invented until at least 500,000 years ago. So putting a stone point on a spear was the oldest such implement is known to be about 500,000 years ago from Southern Africa. So how do they hunt, right? And we think the answer, of course, is endurance running. And so the way it works is that this is a graph of human locomotor speeds compared to a horse, a pony, and a dog. And in orange, we've got running, and in blue, we've got walking. Actually, in blue, we have actually a trotting, excuse me, which is for quadrupeds, they're a long distance gait. You can't make quadrupeds gallop long distances. And you can see that the human endurance running range is actually above the trot gallop transition speed of actually all of these animals, including horses, although I dare say most of us watching this cannot run 5 or 6 meters per second for very long. But of course, elite athletes can, but even average, professors like me can run above the trot gallop transition speed of ponies and dogs. In fact, I did that this morning on my run around the Charles River, right? And so humans can run long distances at speeds that exceed the trot gallop transition speed of most quadrupeds. And why is that important? Because when we run, we cool by sweating. When you run, you generate a lot of heat, and in fact, only about 1/4 of the energy you use when you're running is actually goes into movement. The other 3/4 goes into heat, and you have to dump that heat. And the way that quadrupeds dump that heat is by panting, right? Short, little, shallow breaths. But when you gallop, which is a seesaw gait, when your body tilts like a seesaw, you can't pant because the viscera, are slamming into the diaphragm with each stride. This is well known and well studied. So galloping quadrupeds can't pant, but we cool by sweating. So we've decoupled our thermoregulation from locomotion. And that enables us to do some really cool things. So one is power scavenging, and this is well documented in different cultures. But in the middle of the day, if you know that there's a meat resource, like a kill, for example, and you see, for example, if you see vultures in the distance, you can run. And if you can get there in the middle of the day before the hyenas do, as you can see from this wonderful photoshopped image, which of course does not, you have yourself, some excellent, food to eat, right? Bones to scavenge, etc. And then the other, and I think really exciting way of hunting is called persistence hunting. It's still practiced, very rarely though, but we have ethnographic evidence from all around the world. But in the middle of the day, when it's really hot, you pick an animal, and the bigger the better, because the larger you are, the more heat you generate. So bigger animals, like bigger humans, overheat faster. And then the hunter, or hunters usually, they'll chase the animal. The animal has to gallop to run away, and then it hides under a bush, tries to recover its body temperature, and then you walk while you're doing that to track it, chase it again. It's a combination of walking and running, tracking and chasing. And eventually you can run pretty much any animal if you're good at it. And the hard part is actually not the running, it's the tracking, because they're running at a very gradual pace. And usually it takes about a half marathon basically to drive prey into hyperthermia, as this hunter is doing here with this kudu, right? So that's called persistence hunting, and it's well documented. And it's been, we have evidence from it, from every ethnographic evidence from every continent except for, of course, Antarctica. So all in all, walking, running, digging, all kinds of other things. I haven't gone into all the other kinds of physical activities, but there's been a more than doubling of physical activity levels. So if you look at active energy expenditure relative to fat-free mass, hunter-gatherers are way more than twice what chimpanzees spend, and even sedentary human beings spend way more physical energy on physical activity than wild chimpanzees. So if you think you're sedentary, just watch a chimp. And yet, remember energy allocation theory, because of trade-offs, right? Humans are evolved to be more physically active than apes, but still, you only want to be as physically active as you need to, right? You only want to do it when it's necessary or rewarding. Otherwise, any physical activity that you do that doesn't benefit your fitness, that is your reproductive fitness, your Darwinian fitness, is energy wasted. So for example, this morning I went for a long run, about 10 miles, so I probably spent about 1,000 calories. If I had been a hunter-gatherer, it was a completely stupid thing to do, right? I mean, I would basically be wasting all that energy, which I could be using on my family and reproduction and things like that. So people have this idea that hunter-gatherers are incredibly physically active, but they're actually only moderately physically active. So we have data from for example, populations like the Hadza, but others as well. And if you look at the levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity, so basically a brisk walk or above, they spend about 2.25 hours a day at those levels of physical activity. And they actually sit for about 10 hours a day. So they're actually not that different from Americans or Brits or whatever in terms of how much they sit. But of course, things have changed, right? They didn't change so much with hours of agriculture, because agriculture, if you don't have tractors and other machines, is really hard work, right? These are scenes from the area in Kenya where we've been doing fieldwork for the last 15 years. But it's really hard work, even a plow, right? I've tried actually after I took this photo, I actually went and tried using that plow with these guys. It's one of most physically demanding things I've ever done in my life. People are carrying water, they're carrying food, they're carrying babies, they're digging. So if you look at physical activity levels of subsistence farmers, they're actually a little bit higher on average than hunter-gatherers. It's hard work. But we invented the modern world, right? So we invented machines, and we have now a post-industrial lifestyle for most of us where we're paid to sit rather than be active. And not surprisingly, physical activity levels have plunged by at least 25%. Again, that's not how much physical activity you're actually doing, that's the physical activity level that's plunged. We've decreased our physical activity levels by many hundreds of calories per day of active energy expenditure. And this has come at an enormous cost to human health. Again, this is from this paper that Dave Reichel and I just recently published in Current Biology. But if you look at just simply steps per day, and I plotted here the hazard ratio of all-cause mortality and the relative risk of incident cardiovascular disease, and then we plotted gorillas and chimps and sedentary humans and hunter-gatherers, and you can see that sedentary humans, of course, are more active than chimps and gorillas, but even then, we're not at the level where this curve begins to flatten off for all-cause mortality, which turns out to be about 7,000 steps a day. And we're way below the level that causes substantial reductions in cardiovascular disease, which, by the way, is the #1 killer of people today in Western industrialized countries like England and the United States. So if you're a hunter-gatherer level sort of physical activity, you decrease your relative risk of incident cardiovascular disease by many fold. Here's another way of looking at it. This is from an enormous study of data pulled from Europe and the United States. In the histograms are the percentage of adults who get different amounts of minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. That's the x-axis. And the blue line here is the relative risk of all-cause mortality. And you can see that most people, of course, are physically inactive and they have high levels of all-cause mortality. Just a little bit of physical activity, like what the World Health Organization recommends, which is 21 minutes a day, 150 minutes a week, results in this is an age-corrected measure of mortality, results in a 30% reduction. And getting down to, it flattens out, but getting down to pre-industrial levels leads to about a 40% reduction in all-cause mortality at a given age. So because of that, right, because physical activity is important, but we live in a world where physical activity has now become optional, we invented exercise, right, which I define as discretionary, voluntary, planned physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. It's kind of a weird thing, right? Imagine telling your hunter-gatherer ancestors to get on a treadmill. They would like look at you and like, what on earth are you asking me to do? And to be honest, I don't really thought about this until I was doing fieldwork actually in northern Mexico. We were studying the Tarahumara, who are famous for their long-distance running. And I was traveling around as being a good anthropologist, and I was measuring people's feet and looking at their biomechanics, but I was also asking them questions. And it was actually this guy here. He's actually an older fellow, and most people there don't run, by the way, but only a few people there are really great runners. And this guy is a famous runner. He's also a shaman. And I remember asking him, through a translator, because I don't speak Raramuri, the local language. And I asked him, how often he trains. And he looked at me, and I could figure out what he was saying. It was like, why would I run if I didn't have to, right? And they don't train, right? They run. Their lifestyle is their training, and they only run when they have races, right? And I realized, what I do is a really weird thing, right? And by weird, I'm using the term that Joe Henrich and company, my colleague Joe Henrich and company, devised called. Which is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. But it's, these are, exercise is something that we invented in the modern world. And it's, lifting weights that you bought for the sole purpose of lifting them is a really weird thing, right? Or getting on a treadmill, this horrible, nasty machine that makes you work really hard and gets you absolutely nowhere, and it's a little bit dangerous, can spit you off, and incredibly boring. I mean, just think about just how weird it is. And by the way, if you think a treadmill is a form of torture, you're actually right. It was actually invented. The kind of treadmill was actually invented in Victorian prisons as a way of preventing prisoners from enjoying themselves. So they had to trudge on these giant treadmills to kind of make their lives more miserable, like in debtor's prisons and things like that. Okay. So we exercise now because exercise is healthy, and we have had to replace physical activity for exercise. But the fundamental problem is that we were selected to avoid physical activity that's neither necessary nor rewarding, right? Otherwise, it's just kind of a stupid waste of energy, right? And a good way of thinking about that is if you've ever been in a subway stop or a hospital or or an airport or whatever where you've got a escalator next to a stairway. And it turns out that wherever you are in the world, whether you're in Japan or the United States or Israel or places they've done this study, only about 5% of people will actually naturally take the stairs. 95% of people will line up to take the escalator because it's an instinct, right? It's a basic fundamental instinct to avoid physical activity that's neither necessary nor rewarding. For most people, climbing up the stairs is neither necessary nor rewarding. By the way, just for the shot, I actually photoshopped this woman onto the stairs because I thought it was pathetically, so few people on the stair. Okay, so there was selection for increased physical activity, but there's also selection for avoiding exercise, but that doesn't really explain why physical activity or exercise reduces our vulnerability to disease and also slows senescence. To give you some evidence for this, there's lots and lots of studies. One of my favorites, because I'm a professor at Harvard, is actually the first big major epidemiological study that was ever conducted on exercise and aging by this guy over here, Ralph Paffenbarger. He's a great innovator in exercise science. He was a professor here at Harvard Medical School, and he realized that places like Harvard, or for that matter, I'm sure Cambridge, are fantastic for these kinds of studies because Cambridge and Harvard never let go of their graduates, right? When you guys graduate from Cambridge, I mean, I get letters from Cambridge all the time asking me for money, and you will too, right? They will never, wherever corner of the planet you are on, they will continue to keep finding you and keep track of you, right? And so Paffenbarger realized this was a fantastic opportunity to study aging and exercise. And so he followed for more than 25 years a group of alumni from several different classes, got information about their physical activity rates and whether they smoked and all kinds of other covariate data. And this is a famous graph that he published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But on the y-axis is the all-cause death rate, summarized to per 10,000 years. And on the x-axis is their physical activity level in 3 bins. So people who got less than 500 calories a week of physical activity, so basically sedentary individuals, and he's normalized them, and the numbers are the normalized to values of 1. People who got between 500 and 2,000 calories of exercise a week, so just a little bit, but not a lot. And people who got more than 2,000 calories of exercise, which, if you want to know, is like basically going for a run 4 times a week for like a few miles each, right? So it's not a crazy amount of physical activity. And you can see that for the alums, and this is what's nice about the study, is that even though it's adjusted for covariates, it's not a very diverse sample, so he's been able to correct for socioeconomic class and things like that. But you can see that the alums who are between the ages of 25 and 49, the ones who got 2,000 calories a week had 21% lower death rates than the ones who were sedentary. The ones who were in their 50s, the exercisers had 36% lower death rates than the ones who are sedentary. By the time you get to your 70s, you have 50% lower death rates. And remember, this is not just a filter because of people who are sick can't exercise. I mean, that's been corrected for in the study. So what we're really seeing is that as you get older, physical activity has more and more effect than when you're younger in terms of your health. And this has been shown by many, many other studies. So this is just the first big study to show this. So the question is why? And the answer, I believe, is what we call the active grandparent hypothesis, which is there's been selection in human evolution for lifelong physical activity to extend health spans, hence lifespans. And that explains why physical activity is increasingly healthy as we should age. And this is a paper we published 2 years ago in PNAS. I should acknowledge my co-sponsor, my co-writers, which is Aaron Bagash here, who's now formerly at Harvard, now at the University of Lausanne, Ayman Lee, who's a professor at the medical school here, and 2 graduate students here, Tim Kistner and Daniel Richard, are both really great folks. Actually, Daniel Richard just got his PhD, so no longer a graduate student. Okay, so to explain this, a key concept is the selective shadow, which some of you may have encountered in evolutionary biology classes, but the idea comes from Sir Peter Medawar, which is that as we age, we get older, but senescence is deterioration associated with age. And what Medawar showed was, or described, was that once you stop reproducing, natural selection really doesn't care about you, right? One of the reasons why we senesce and die is that we become we become irrelevant to selection, right? So we call that the selective shadow. But obviously humans are a little bit different. There's been something about the selective shadow which has changed in humans, right? We have this unique life history. So whereas chimpanzees have the slower life history than monkeys and can live somewhat longer, and there's a current interesting vigorous debate about just how long chimpanzees can live in the wild. In captivity, they can live longer than in the wild, but very few chimpanzees make it to their 40s in the wild, right? And very few chimpanzees live to be post-reproductive. But typical hunter-gatherers, whose median age of death is 68 to 78 if they survive childhood, about a quarter of hunter-gatherers in any population tend to be post-reproductive. And the average hunter-gatherer female lives about 20 years after she stopped reproducing, right? And this is often called the grandmother hypothesis. There's also the embodied capital hypothesis. But the important point is that these grandparents are actually doing important things. They're increasing their reproductive success by doing stuff that helps their children and their offspring. And that's shifted the selective shadow in humans compared to apes. I should point out that there's been, of course, an enormous amount of research, including colleagues here, on the heritability and the genetics of lifespan. But it turns out that lifespan doesn't have a very high heritability. And we can talk more about why lifespan is actually a really bad variable in a second. But if you actually look at the data, before the age of 80, there's actually a pretty low heritability, less than 0.2, and that's certainly an overestimate. And there are nobody's ever found a gene of large effect. So the major causes of premature death are behavioral patterns, so what you eat, physical activity, your social circumstances like stress, pollution, and by the way, access to healthcare explains only about 10% of the variance, right? So humans you can't really look to genes as being a major cause of this. And from an evolutionary perspective, I would argue that we shouldn't even be focusing on lifespan. What we really need to do is focus on health span. So health span is the number of years you live without major disease, right? And until the invention of modern medicine, lifespan and health span were basically the same thing. So if you look in populations that don't have access to medical care, once people get to end of life morbidity, once their health span is over, they don't last very long, and they have a very quick period towards death. And this is very well studied, right? And we can make some estimates about the Upper Paleolithic, from hunter-gatherers. We know data from the era of agriculture before the Industrial Revolution, where lifespan and health span were definitely shortened. And today in America, for example, the average lifespan of American, actually I need to change the slide. This has just changed a few days ago. The lifespan of Americans has declined by a year or two because of COVID and suicide. So it's now 77. But the average health span of our average American is 63. So that means the average American, and that's average, right? So there are plenty of people who are worse than this, spends 16 years prior to dying with major morbidity like cardiovascular disease and other sorts of things that you wouldn't have survived prior to modern medicine. So the active grandparent hypothesis is that physical activity is actually a major contributor to this extension of health span and and affecting that period of morbidity. So there are essentially 4 predictions, right? So the first is that we evolved to be more physically active than apes. The second is that we evolved to remain physically active as we age. The third, there's selection for physical activity to promote health lifespan, and that's probably the most important one. And then finally, this is kind of one that's a little bit more of a question mark here, which is that physical activity affects health span and lifespan more in humans than other animals. So let's look at these 4 predictions. So the first one I've already kind of told you about, so we don't have to spend any time on it, right? Which is that humans evolved to be more physically active than apes. And I already showed you the data behind this. It's pretty clear, right? The second one is that we evolved to remain physically active as we age. And that's also not really very contentious, right? So this is, for example, a graph of data from the Hadza, collected by Dave Reichland and Brian Wood and Herman Ponzer, compared to the average for US males and US females. I don't think England is going to be much different from the US graph. And you can see that there's a decline in both populations, including among the Hadza, but even like 70, 80-year-old Hadza are still 15 times more active than your average equivalent aged Westerner, right? So they're still hunting, they're still gathering every day. There's lots of evidence for this. Another example of this is data that was collected many years ago by Kristen Hawkes on the Hadza. and she looked at how many hours a day were spent digging. She compared females before they had offspring, mothers and grandmothers, and you can see that grandmothers are digging 4 to 8 hours a day as opposed to mothers who are digging 2 to 5 hours a day. So physical activity levels remain high, if not higher, in grandparents than parents. And of course, the reason for that is because of energy, right? So this is a super famous graph from a super famous paper by Kaplan et al. In 2000. And what this shows is chimpanzees, this is age in the x-axis. These are females and males in the two graphs. This is calories per day on the y-axis. And you can see that chimpanzees, production and consumption is the same. But in humans, production is in the solid line and consumption is in the dashed line. And human females run a deficit up until they become grandparents, right? And it's only when they become grandparents they start producing more than they consume. And of course, they're giving that surplus to their children and their grandchildren. Males are, of course, also producing a surplus. That's through hunting and honey collecting and other sorts of things. And so they're also contributing food to their children and their grandchildren. All right, so we evolved to be more physically active as we age and stay physically active as we age. So the third prediction is probably the most complicated one, right? But in some ways the most important one, and that there's been selection for physical activity to promote health span. And again, remember, prior to modern medicine, health span equals lifespan. And again, to go back to our fundamentals, that's because of trade-offs, right? When you are physically active, right, you're using energy, but that also generates stress, right? And that energy use is a stress. So there are several trade-offs. So the first trade-off is that physical activity diverts energy from reproduction, right? So when you're more physically active, you can spend less energy on reproduction. And there's lots of data on this. A very simple one actually comes from the office I'm actually sitting in. My person who had this office before me was Peter Ellison, a famous reproductive endocrinologist. And he did a study here in Cambridge where he looked at healthy women who were just jogging 20 kilometers a week. So they're spending only 180 kilocalories a day on physical activity. This is not a lot, right? This is pretty mild levels of physical activity. And he showed that, and this is salivary progesterone on the y-axis, days before menstruation on the x-axis. And you can see that in red, the women who were running, spending just 180 calories a day, nothing serious, have 50% lower levels of progesterone than sedentary women. Now you could say, one way of thinking about this is saying, oh, being physically active depresses your energy allocation to reproduction, but think about it, 180 calories a day is nothing, right? And what it really is that is a reverse, which is that when you're physically inactive, your body says, hey, I've got more energy and I can increase the levels I'm going to spend of energy I can spend on reproduction. So actually, it's a shift upward in these sedentary women who have now higher levels of progesterone, they have higher levels of estrogen. Males who are inactive have higher levels of testosterone. And of course, that has important effects on health, which we'll talk about in a second, for example, for breast cancer. The other trade-off, right, has to do with stress, right? And because when you're physically active, you're stressing your body, right? Whoops, sorry. Actually, let me go back to that previous thing about reproduction. Sorry, I went in the wrong direction, right? So this is data showing hours per week of what's called a MET. So a MET is a metabolic equivalent. So a MET of 1 is the energy you spend just sitting, right? And this is the odds ratio of getting breast cancer. This is lifetime risk of breast cancer for estrogen and progesterone sensitive breast cancer. So women who exercise an hour a day, right? This is a meta-analysis, not just one study, have an overall lifetime reduction of about 55% in their lifetime risk of breast cancer, right? And that's because estrogen and progesterone are mitotic hormones that increase the risk of cancer. And in fact, if you look at all cancers, it doesn't matter which kind of cancer you're looking at, every kind of cancer, people who exercise an hour a day have on average about a 30% reduction of cancer than people who don't exercise, right? And this is just an hour of walking a day. This is not like running, right? So physical activity, by diverting energy from reproduction, actually has a benefit, because in our sedentary world, what we're doing is we're allocating excess energy to reproduction. Okay. The second trade-off is between physical activity and fat storage. And I don't think this is too controversial. This is if you spend less energy in physical activity and you're still taking in the same amount of energy, you can store that as fat, right? And here's a very famous experiment that was done by a collaborator of mine, Bente Klarland Olsen in Denmark. But she got 14 Danish guys to basically just sit for 2 weeks, but not change their diet. And just in 2 weeks, they added a lot of fat, especially they added visceral fat. That's fat in the abdomen. That's highly inflammatory fat. This is the fat that causes a wide range of metabolic diseases. So this is an MRI scan of the same guy before and after. So he added quite a lot of visceral fat just by sitting for 2 weeks. And when you have a combination of fat plus physical inactivity, you get basically a double whammy. So when fat cells swell, they become dysfunctional and they attract white blood cells that simulate inflammation. And inflammation is the major cause of most of the diseases that we're scared about, from Alzheimer's to diabetes and atherosclerosis and heart disease, etc. But importantly, it turns out that when you're physically inactive, in addition to storing more fat, which causes inflammation, turns out that physical activity and use of muscles is the major way in which the body suppresses inflammation. Again, this is research that we're doing in conjunction with Bente Petersen in Copenhagen. And we just published this paper in Nature Metabolism with Tim Kistner, my grad student. And so what's going on here is that when you're physically active, right, you increase all kinds of stresses. You increase lactic acid production, you have less glycogen in your muscles. That's glycogen is the mammalian form of carbohydrate. You increase reactive oxygen species, which cause all kinds of damage. And that causes your muscles to secrete interleukin-6, which is this cytokine, which regulates the immune system. And IL-6 actually evolved as an energetic regulator, right? It increases gluconeogenesis, so the production of glucose by the liver. It increases breakdown of fat in muscles, in fat cells and in muscles. And that makes, sugar and fats available, which your muscles can then use. But then it turns out that the immune system co-opted this signal, this regulator, this cytokine. And it turns out it's the major energetic regulator of inflammation. And so at low levels of IL-6, it's actually inflammatory, but high levels of IL-6 actually turns on other molecules which actually turn off inflammation. So people who are physically inactive have much higher levels of inflammation than people who are active. In physical activity, your muscles actually produce the vast majority of this IL-6 at high levels, which actually decreases inflammation. Stay tuned. We have more to come on that. We have a lot of studies coming from my lab on that. So the third trade-off is kind of related to that, which is that physical activity diverts energy towards repair and maintenance, as I just told you, right? So when you're physically active, you cause various kinds of stresses, reactive oxygen species, and damage in every tissue in your body. But every single tissue in your body turns on various kinds of repair and maintenance mechanisms that are activated by physical activity to prevent physical activity from being deleterious, right? So when you're physically active and you produce reactive oxygen species, your muscles also produce antioxidants that wipe up those reactive oxygen species. Your muscles produce anti-inflammatories, as I just showed you. Your muscles turn on other enzymes that repair cells and DNA and turns on growth factors for pretty much every tissue of your body, from your muscle to your brain to your bone to your liver, etc. Right? That's why physical activity is healthy. And we can actually measure the energetic costs. And this is, again, something that we're spending a lot of time and energy in my lab doing. And this is, it's colloquially called afterburn, but we call it excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, because we're not allowed to use simple terms, right? Or EPOC. So if you go for, if you're sitting around and then you go for a run, right? You're going to use all this energy. Then afterwards, your metabolism is going to be elevated for a certain amount of time. It depends on how much and how long will depend on the kind of activity that you engaged in, right? And we can measure that with oxygen. It's not too hard to do. And it turns out that if you have somebody do basically a sort of standard Hadza life, physical activity level, right, where you're walking 150 minutes a day and maybe do 20 minutes a day of sort of more vigorous physical activity, that turns on an EPOC response of about 50 to 100 calories a day. And that's way more than the EPOC response of just moderate physical activity. So somebody who does just 41 minutes a day, or somebody who's basically inactive, or follows just the US, World Health Organization recommendations of 20 minutes, 20 minutes a day, right? And by the way, epoch, only about the maximum epoch that's spent on energy replacement is about 20%. So 80% is going into repair and maintenance. So you can calculate over many, many years. So for example, if you spend 20 years exercising like a Hadza compared to an inactive American, you're going to spend 282,800 more calories over that time period on repair and maintenance. And I factored out the energy you spent on just replacing the energy that you used. Okay? That's an enormous amount of energy. That's enough to run hundreds and hundreds of marathons, right? And so it's not chump change. It's a really substantial amount of energy. Okay, so that's the third prediction. And the fourth and final prediction is that physical activity affects health span more in humans than other animals. And this, I have to admit, is the most conjectural part. And I'm not going to bet the farm on this one. But if you look at other animals, like for example, rodents, when you exercise them, they don't live longer if you exercise them. So for example, rats, if you exercise them, they don't actually have a more survival or longer lifespan than rats who are sedentary. Same is true of mice. And in fact, if you look at, this is a paper that was published in Nature just a few years ago, where they looked at mortality rates and also rates of senescence in wild versus captive animals. And they were thinking, well, if you correct for predation, you'd think that wild animals would do better than animals in zoos because they're more active and they're more healthy, etc. But actually, it's quite the reverse, right? Animals in zoos have slower rates of senescence. They have longer maximum lifespans. So it looks like physical activity in these animals is not having a major effect. Of course, there's issues of animal care and veterinary care, etc. So I wouldn't, bet the farm on this one. All right, just to sum up, for the active grant hypothesis predictions, right? Humans evolved to be more physically active than apes. I think we can agree on that. We evolved to remain physically active as we age. I don't think that's controversial. I think we can agree that there's been selection for physical activity to promote health span and therefore lifespan and the age before medical care. I think we can hopefully agree on that. And then finally, again, a bit more conjectural, but I think there's some evidence, and of course this needs to be studied more, that physical activity affects health span and lifespan more in humans than in other animals. So to conclude, we were selected for lifelong physical activity. We're also selected to avoid unnecessary, unrewarding physical activity, aka exercise. The stress and energy costs of physical activity cause trade-offs that allocate energy away from investments that compromise health and towards repair and maintenance. And overall, I would argue that our evolutionary history explains why lifelong physical activity is so important for slowing senescence and decreasing our vulnerability to many diseases. It's not a magic bullet, but it sure is important. And as the world becomes more sedentary, especially as people move from rural areas to urban areas around the world, we really need to pay more attention to helping people be more physically active. And I think evolutionary biology and human evolutionary research has an important role to play in that. And then finally, one last thought to kind of leave you with, which is that if we evolve to be physically activity only when it's necessary and rewarding, we have to find ways to make exercise both necessary and rewarding. And I have very fond memories of punting on the cam back in the day. I hope all of you get a chance to do that. Maybe it's a good Valentine's Day thing to do. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. And there are lots of folks that have helped out with this. And if you're more interested, I've got a book we recently just published on this called Exercised. And also, I encourage you to check out the active grandparent hypothesis in PNAS. So with that, I'll stop talking.
All right, thank you very much for that talk. Yeah, so now we'll take questions. You can either feel free to use the raise hand function and unmute yourself and ask a question, or if your microphone's not working or you're not comfortable asking out loud, you can just send it in the chat. So I don't know if Professor Stringer would like to ask it out loud or if I should read it. I guess I'll read it. So he says, is selection acting differently for grandfathers versus grandmothers?
Chris, nice to see you here. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think selection is probably is different for males and females because of their different life history and reproductive strategies. But there's no question that physical activity is both helpful for males and females, and that the mechanisms that they act on, right, are probably the same, right? So, when males and females exercise, they both produce antioxidants. They both produce IL-6 that cuts down on inflammation. They both produce, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which decreases, which restores synapses in the brain and promotes neuronal growth. So I'm sure that there are differences in the way energy is allocated in males and females. We know that for sure, but the repair and maintenance, and certainly selection may be acting differently on the kind of on that aspect and sort of fat storage. But the repair and maintenance mechanisms, I would suspect, are probably pretty similar for males and females. That said, males and females will tell you different prices for how they they reproduce over age. So I'm sure that there are probably some subtle differences, but I don't think it changes the basic argument. But great question.
Yeah, and I also have a question. Well, I guess people gather their thoughts for more. So I guess you said with the couch potato hypothesis that the animals are like conserving their energy, not doing excess energy like when they don't have to, so that they can reallocate that for more fitness enhancing activities. And I know you said for the zoo animals like tended to live longer when they're being less active, but that might be due to like veterinary care, like lack of predation. There's no poaching. But
that study corrected for predation, so that corrected.
Okay.
So that was they only looked at maximum lifespan rather than when animals died because of being eaten by each other.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess that kind of helps answer it. But I noticed with the rodents, it looked like they all lived about the same, whether they're exercising or not. So do you know why the rodents which exercise more like wouldn't die sooner, because they're just using their energy for non-fitness enhancing activities?
Well, that's a good question. So we first of all, rodents have very different life histories than humans, right? I mean, they're very R-selected. They're basically evolved to pump out as many babies as possible because life, you never know when a cat's going to kill you, right? So they're not selected for that kind of long post-reproductive lifespan, and so since you wouldn't expect there to be as much selection for the repair and maintenance mechanisms that result from physical activity to have any effect on health span longevity. In other words, repair and maintenance is not the function, not the goal of a rodent, right? It's just pumping out as many babies as quickly as possible. So again, this is the most speculative part of the hypothesis, but the important point is that because humans have a different life history than other animals, because of this post-reproductive period, and because during that post-reproductive period, we didn't evolve to go to Florida, right, and kick up our heels and just do nothing, right? We evolved, hunter-gatherer grandparents aren't just sitting around in camp waiting for people to come back and feed them, right? They're off every day hunting and gathering and, taking care of grandchildren and doing all kinds of stuff. And so they're living long in order to be physically active. And that physical activity is helping them live longer in a healthy state, right? And so because of that, the prediction is that there should be more selection for that. I'm not saying there's no selection for that in other animals, but that plays a greater role in humans. And so you can make the case that that's why we call it the active grandparent hypothesis, that the role of physical activity as we get older is important for maintaining health span, which in turn allows hunter-gatherers to be active to improve their reproductive success. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And are there any other questions?
I'll ask one. So there's obviously no question that an increase in exercise is very much beneficial for decreasing cardiovascular disease and inflammation. But do a lot of these studies account for perhaps the fact that they've got Hadza and hunter-gatherers generally have a better diet and lifestyle? They've got a more diverse gut microbiome, and their general natural environment that they're living in day to day is a lot more attuned to nature and their metabolism, and also that in their resting state, even the Hadza are more active, they're squatting rather than just sitting.
No, actually, first of all, squatting doesn't take much energy, let me tell you. But the data we have on the health benefits of physical activity do not come from the Hadza. I'm only using Hadza for data on what the average physical activity level of was in humans. The data that we have on the health benefits of physical activity come from studies of literally millions and millions of people around the world in every country on the planet, right? So those data don't come from Hadza, or from any other hunter-gatherer population. What we do know is, of course, is that many of those hunter-gatherer populations suffer less from the kinds of mismatch diseases that we have today, right? That's what my previous book, The Story of the Human Body, was about, right? So cardiovascular disease is less common in those populations. Cancers are probably less common in those populations, but they're harder to diagnose. Alzheimer's probably less in those populations. And part of that comes from their diet, of course, but part of that also comes from physical activity because they're very physically active. So the test of that hypothesis would be to look at physically inactive Hadza, right? And see what happens to them, right? Now, we can't do that naturally for the Hadza. You can't do an experiment like that. That's unethical. But we have those data from plenty of other populations. So the population in Kenya, where I work, right? Where we look at people who move from rural to urban areas and become less physically active and don't change their diet, for example, we can actually look at that. They're much more likely to get diabetes and all kinds of other diseases. So that's been well studied in population after population, including non-Western populations.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, it looks like there's a question in the chat. So Eva says, similar to Chris's question, do you have ideas on how menopause relates to physical activity in older women? Since they progressively have lower levels of sex hormones, this could mean the trade-off is different than in older males.
So menopause is not menopause is caused by atresia, and the rate at which you lose eggs, and that's not affected by estrogen or progesterone. Actually, the eggs themselves are producing the progesterone and the estrogen. So physically active women are not more, do not hit menopause at different times than less physically active women. So that's not the effect that's going on. Certainly, physical activity does affect hormone levels in women profoundly, and that has effects on many aspects of their biology that, of course, are relevant to health, but it's not affecting the age at which they go through menopause.
And then I guess the second half of her question, I guess, is asking whether
well, I mean, sure, reproductive between energy. I mean, females use energy differently for reproduction than males. Absolutely. I mean, I was sort of pointing that out. So no, I'm not saying that they're the same in males and females. Of course not. So remember, there are different kinds of trade-offs that are physical activity costs. One is the trade-off that's sort of energy allocation towards reproduction. That's, of course, can be stronger in females than in males. But the other trade-off is between energy allocation towards repair and maintenance. And I don't believe that that's going to be different between females and males. I have no evidence. I've never seen any evidence that it's at all different.
All right. Yeah, thank you for that. And then I guess we have one more question, and I guess we can make this the final question. And so someone also says, how can you test the hypotheses in early humans?
Well, you can't. I mean, you can't do physiology in early humans, right? What we can, I mean, we have to study biology of modern creatures, but we can study how exercise functions in humans. We can study how it functions in other species. Many of the biological mechanisms are the same. We haven't invented this complete new biology. We can also study, we can get estimates of physical activity, but not very good ones from the fossil record. We can look at when hunting started and when, come on in. Excuse me, I have office hours, so some students are going to be trumping it, but I'll finish.
Sure.
If you could just open the door and then, so we can't we can't be precise about it, but hunting and gathering, there's no way to be a hunter-gatherer without spending a fair amount of physical activity. You have to travel around and find resources, and you have to hunt, you have to scavenge. So modern hunter, and there's no way that modern hunter-gatherers are working. If I were Homo erectus without as much technology as a Hadza, I have the same body size, but I don't have as much technology. So if anything, I probably have to work harder to get the same number of calories. So I think they're reasonable minimum estimates of physical activity. And you also just look at the biology. I mean, they're adapted for running. They have all kinds of physical, big gluteus maximuses and short toes and arches in their feet and semicircular canals. So we can see that they have all this anatomy that makes no sense except for physical activity, for long distance walking, for running, for carrying, all those sorts of things.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the talk. It's been very interesting, spurred a lot of questions. And thank you for agreeing to come and give it.
My pleasure. Happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah, happy Valentine's Day. And then just wanted to give a short announcement that actually in 2 weeks, our next talk will be with Professor Cheryl LaRoche on the power and lessons of Black history. So please join us. So thank you and have a nice Valentine's Day.
All right, take care. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.